In this series of 3 videos, we'll look at the history of American education. In this first video, we'll look at the period from Columbus's arrival through the early national period of the early 1800s. At the time of Columbus's arrival, Native Americans didn't have established schools to teach their children, but did maintain a system to ensure that their youth had the knowledge and skills to thrive. From a young age, children were separated by gender, boys following men and learning skills considered masculine, such as hunting and warfare, and girls following women and learning skills considered feminine, such as agriculture and cooking. All Native children learned about the natural environment and geography and various manufacturing and construction skills. Native societies also thought it was important for children to learn the cultural traditions and religion of their people, a task often assigned to elders who passed on oral traditions. Many Native societies had a formal ceremony to signify when a child had reached maturity and thus was considered an adult. As the colonial era passed, there were some efforts to, quote, civilize Native Americans into European culture, often evangelism by religious groups. They were, however, sporadic and the rare exception rather than the rule. Now, when it came to the European colonists themselves, the very earliest settlers simply taught their children in their home, and this remained the most important method for education for most settlers throughout much of the 17th century, the 1600s. The Puritans, who tended to be more literate so that they could read the Bible, would stress the basics, simple reading, writing, and arithmetic. The first school, however, was founded as early as 1635. This school, the Boston Latin School, was created by Puritans to serve the sons of the town's leaders, those deemed predestined for heaven. A so-called Latin school would provide a little more advanced education, including things like, as its name implies, the classics. In this way, it was sort of an early high school. In the 1640s, Massachusetts Bay Colony was the first colony to create taxpayer-supported schools when it mandated the towns of 50 families have an elementary school and the towns of 100 or more have a Latin school. Attendance was compulsory, the first colony to do so. A few other colonies, including those in the Upper South, followed suit as the 17th century progressed, but the schools were often no more than basic socialization, stressing such things as morality, religion, and community, and still basically leaving the reading, writing, and arithmetic skills to the families. Schools would import textbooks from England, but the first American textbook came in 1690 when Benjamin Harris published his famous New England Primer. It was published to help New England children learn the Puritan faith and good morals. The lessons were based on rote memorization. Besides those fortunate to have a literate family or in a town that had even the rudimentary school, most children simply learned a trade from their father or in an apprenticeship, working under someone who had a skill they would learn. Throughout the South, the rich planter class would often hire a tutor to teach their children, and the wealthiest might send their children back to England for a more advanced education. People arriving in the South as indentured servants who agreed to work for a planter for a set number of years in exchange for the cost of transport to America learned necessary skills through those who hired them. While many didn't live out their indentured period, those who did and then became free had the knowledge of what they had learned during their apprenticeship. After slavery developed, slaves learned the skills the planters required through what was termed seasoning of slaves. Some planters would do this by assigning new slave arrivals to a veteran slave who would acclimate and instruct them. Others, however, worried that if the new arrivals learned how bad it was from a veteran, they might try to immediately escape and thus had a white, quote, overseer lead a group of instruction. Regardless, throughout the colonial era, teaching slaves to read and write was mostly illegal, as knowledge, of course, was power. The roots of American higher education, or the first colleges, dated back to the 17th century. The Puritans established Harvard College as early as 1636, only a year after the Boston Latin School. Named for an early benefactor, its purpose was to train Puritan ministers. By the late 17th century, however, it attracted the sons of wealthy New Englanders who planned careers in law, government, or business. The second college was the College of William and Mary, established by wealthy benefactors, the Virginia colonial government, and the Anglican Church. It became the center for the education of the Virginia planter class in law, government, and business. Students who went into the Anglican ministry were not charged tuition. By the early 18th century, the 1700s, a number of other colleges were formed. Yale College in the colony of Connecticut, named for an early benefactor, was founded in 1701 by Puritans who were upset that Harvard had drifted from its strict Puritan mission. By the late 18th century, many of the New England colonies had established colleges, which in time became the foundation for what was later known as the Ivy League. While girls would learn from their families, tutors, or religious institutions, often excluded by the schools, one of the first schools established solely for girls was the Ursuline Academy in New Orleans, founded by Catholic nuns in 1727. It wasn't until the late 18th century that some New England colonies allowed local communities to create tax-supported schools for girls. Before the Revolution, however, few did. Still, throughout the colonial period, girls and boys were taught different things. While boys were taught both reading and writing, as well as arithmetic and civic affairs, girls were usually just taught to read. Most colonists assumed girls needed to read so they could understand the Bible, but beyond that, they had little need for any formal education. Still, however, wealthy families would often hire tutors to teach their daughters not only art, music, and dance, but things like the classics, philosophy, and a foreign language. When they did so, its purpose was to identify their daughters among the elite classes and to attract wealthy husbands from those classes. After the American Revolution, the Founding Fathers realized that education was essential to the nation's future, but had different ideas about how to proceed. Thomas Jefferson, for one, proposed a two-track educational system, with different tracks for, in his words, quote, the laboring and the learned. Scholarships would allow some of the laboring class to advance by, quote, raking a few geniuses from the rubbish. Jefferson had a profound impact on education. He assured that when the new federal government established a mechanism to divide and sell the Northwest Territory, the area around the Great Lakes, it would sell land on a grid pattern of small, affordable lots, but would always maintain lots for schools. Jefferson also famously established the University of Virginia, even designing its famous rotunda, an academical village as he called it, where students and faculty would live and learn around a green. After the Revolution, South Carolina and Georgia attempted to create their own universities, but most families able to afford college would still send their sons to New England colleges. In New England after the Revolution, the wealthy helped establish private, full-tuition boarding schools for boys. Some of these still exist today, while others progressed into colleges. Also spreading in New England after the Revolution was the idea of Republican motherhood, a new sentiment that recognized the need to better educate women. Women were critical in the raising of their children, and if they had the knowledge as well as the virtue, they would help spread the idea of self-governance, independence, and patriotism that the new nation needed. These good Republican mothers would then raise good Republican citizens. As a result of this new sentiment, a number of private female academies also grew up across New England and even into some of the Upper South. Not only did the new American government realize that educating women might benefit the new nation, it also began some funding for efforts to, quote, civilize the Native Americans. In 1819, Congress passed the Indian Civilization Act, which provided small funds to religious and charitable groups who established, as they called them, mission schools among the native tribes. The federal government continued financial support for these mission schools until the late 19th century, and by that point, they had become boarding schools that sought to end all vestiges of native culture. The ideals of the American Revolution, independence and liberty, led to the growth of abolitionism in the northern states, the drive to end slavery. Now, as part of this sentiment, the New York Manumission Society created the African Free School just after the Revolution, which led to similar schools in early national age. The African Free School was one of the first schools dedicated solely to the education of the, quote, free blacks, those not slaves, anywhere in the country. The American Revolution also spawned a drive to stop using English books, and when Noah Webster published his famous Blueback Speller in 1783, it became the pedagogical blueprint for American textbooks in the years that followed. It was arranged so that the lessons progressed by age. Students would be required to master one part before moving on to the next. The speller started with the alphabet, followed in sequence by the sounds of vowels and consonants, syllables, simple words, complex words, and finally, sentences. A reflection of the idea of religious freedom and the separation of church and state, the speller was entirely secular and ended with a brief history of America from Columbus through the Revolution. In any event, this concludes the first video, which covers the colonial era through the early national period.